are plastic free. So here are some misconceptions. I certainly labored under these misconceptions for a very long time. We see a lot of photos and reports about plastic ending up in the ocean, and sort of there's this idea that it is mainly an ocean problem. And if we can just clean up our oceans, that everything will kind of be fine. So given that rivers run to the sea, as the saying goes, of course, this is going to end up in the ocean, but that's not at all where it starts. We also learn a lot of times that, people doing things like in this picture, litter bugging and illegal dumping are where our plastic comes from. And that's simply not the case. It is estimated that about 15 to 20% of the plastic that ends up in the environment is the result of intentional throwing out, intentional dumping, intentional litter bugging. But that's not the bulk of it by far. There is a lot of attempts at education around recycling. And while I still think we do need to try and recycle wherever possible, we will see that it is not really working very well, and that places the onus very, very much on us as the consumers, and sort of sets up this complex where it's our fault that plastic is ending up in the environment. And if we just all recycled properly, then everything would be okay. So it must be our fault. It's not the fact that there's too much plastic that's the problem. It's that we're not recycling properly. We have learned over decades that plastic is necessary. And I would say that in some cases, such as life-saving medical situations, I would argue that it is necessary and it is good to use it. But we have an enormous amount of unnecessary single-use plastics that are causing a lot of havoc, and those are not necessary to continue using, and in fact are resulting in the crisis that we're currently in as far as plastic is concerned. We're taught that it makes food and water safer, and we'll see a lot of evidence to the contrary on that. And basically that there's a life cycle of plastic, and other than the end litter that we have a problem with, the rest of it is very benign. And we're going to see tonight that it is not benign at any stage of its lifeline. I don't want to call it a cycle because it's not really a cycle, not being truly biodegradable. There's no cycling going on. So a lifeline. So unfortunately, the realities of the plastic situation are that it is a serious contributor to climate change, global warming. There are environmental justice issues associated with plastic, or should I say injustice, from the beginning to end of plastic's lifeline. It is harmful to both our health and the health of birds and other wildlife. And if we just kind of look around us, all across the world, and some of those pictures that are really distressing that I showed earlier, and this one right here with this great blue heron, we have evidence all around us that we're not dealing with this plastic waste problem properly. If we were dealing with it properly, we wouldn't see what we're seeing. And there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation that ultimately ends up making policy very difficult, regulations on plastic and restrictions on plastic use, and really thinking about the costs of plastic all along its lifeline from the very beginning to the very end. There are a lot of folks that don't want us to make honest policy assessments and honest change assessments. So I would bet that there are others in the audience other than myself that remember when the world did not look like this, where everything was in single-use plastic packaging. Now we have, this is actually from one of the more so-called environmentally friendly grocery stores out there. And you can see here we have, pre-processed produce all in single-use plastic packaging. It is, in every corner of our food world, certainly. And if you've looked around and said, gosh, there really seems to be a lot more plastic than there was, well, that is absolutely the case. This is just 1996 to 2010. and this is the sales of water, just drinking water, in plastic water bottles. And you can see the almost exponential upward trajectory of water bottle sales. And the trajectories from 2010 onward look very similar to this as well. So a lot of this was very much intentional. What you're seeing here is a 1955 Life magazine cover and spread that celebrated the joys of disposable living. So after World War II, when the proliferation of different kinds of plastic as well as amounts of plastic that came from war uses, when when the war was over, manufacturers of those products didn't want to go back to not making them again. They wanted to find different uses for them. And one of those was to move them into our households and celebrate the fact that we could use something once and throw it away. And this was a really big cultural shift, right? This is not how we lived prior to the era of disposable living. And a lot of great marketing went into kind of shifting the narrative amongst consumers that throwaway items were a really good thing. So here's the cover of that magazine. So we really shifted from using, just naturally, if you will, as part of our culture, using reusable items, and had a very big shift as we were marketed that we can use these things, we can throw them away, and we can buy more. Obviously, that's very, very profitable. So from just before 1950, and I'm sorry if you can see my cursor moving around. I'm moving the boxes with people's faces in them so I can see slides better. You can see here is an exponential growth curve since about 1950, a little bit before. This is the production of plastic globally during that time frame. So we went from almost nothing to, almost 500 million tons during that time frame. Very big shift. Recycling, the bent arrow symbol that is now, of course, very famous and recognizable to virtually everyone, was designed in 1970. And I hope you can see there's some text on the right-hand side of the page. And it says, the bent arrow symbol shown below has been chosen to appear on paper or paperboard packages made from recycled or recyclable materials. So that was the original intent of this chasing arrows recycling symbol that was designed. And in the mid-1980s, the plastics industry sort of misappropriated the symbol and used it to designate the different types of resins. So these are different plastic polymers, different combinations of the constituent materials of plastic. Now, these chasing arrows had already become, and were soon to become even more so, very recognizable, as you can take this substance, this product, whatever it is, and you can recycle it. And of course, you can do that with paper, cardboard, paperboard, as it was originally intended. That is not the case with all of these different resin types that are within these chasing arrow symbols. And this misappropriation was done on purpose, really, to make us think like, oh, no problem, we can use these things that are all recyclable. I know that in my community, you can only even hope to recycle 1 and 2. Our recycling collection facility will only take those 2 resin types. There are some communities that will take 5s. There are some very specialized recycling facilities that may take some of the other types. But without getting into, because they're very excellent articles and lectures on recyclables as a market commodity. If there is no market for these materials, it doesn't even really matter if our local collection facilities will take them or not. So we are at a point right now where less than 6% of plastic is actually being recycled. Part of that is that it doesn't make it to the recycling facilities, but part of that is because we simply don't have the infrastructure or the accepting market for these plastic materials that we have. So 3s, 4s, 6s, certainly others, And these are things like polystyrene, known as styrofoam, PVC, folks know that. And so our more common types, 1 and 2, are a little bit more recyclable, but even those are at the 25 to 28% level total. So one thing to come away with is just because something has that chasing arrows symbol on it does not really mean it's recyclable, even though we are meant to believe that it is. So this is often called wish cycling, and I'm 100% guilty of having done this. I really, really want to throw 5s into my recycling bins, even though my local recycling facility does not take that. I want to wish cycle. I don't do that anymore, but it's a hard thing because we all want these things to be reused, made into something else. But the truth of the matter is that they really aren't, and they end up either in incinerators or really best case scenario, I know that sounds odd, but best case scenario in a landfill, actually. So you can see here, these are the results of a study that Greenpeace did. They surveyed, I think, 375 material recycling facilities across the country and asked if they accept some of these very, very common plastics. And you can see the percentages here that do not. So plastic cups, plastic bags, plastic cutlery, plastic plates, even if they have the chasing arrow symbol on them, this is the amount of recycling facilities that said, nope, no way, we don't accept those things. So here's sort of where we're at as far as plastic waste is concerned. And my current understanding is that even 15 million tons is a fairly conservative estimate. So we have a situation where from land-based sources going, eventually ending up in our waterways and then ultimately ending up in the ocean, we have 8 to 15 million tons of plastic that enters the oceans every year. And I would just sort of encourage folks to think about if we really knew how to do good waste management and good recycling, this would not be happening. This is the equivalent of a dump truck dumping a load of plastic into the ocean every minute. And if we knew what we were doing, then this just simply wouldn't be the case. So folks have been sounding the alarm in the environmental community, the scientific community, the citizen science, community science sectors for a pretty long time. So this is 2018, and this is a very straightforward article in Scientific American that says more recycling will not solve the plastic problem. It's a lie that wasteful consumers cause the problem and that changing our individual habits can fix it. That's pretty strong language for Scientific American. There have been some investigations about where all of this stuff that we think we're recycling, where it goes. There have been even more recent studies than this one from The Guardian, where folks have put trackers on bales of supposedly recyclable material that is supposedly being sent to recycling facilities and traced it all over the place, including to landfills, including to incinerators, and including to just sitting in places because no one will take it. So that is a very interesting sort of sideline, is kind of like what is actually happening to this material that we think we're recycling. One of the things that is often mentioned online and in some articles is this, which is that these 10 rivers carry about 90% of the plastic waste that ends up in the oceans. And why I am presenting this to you and why I think it's dangerous is because it's basically saying that, we in the United States or North America or the West in Europe, we've got a handle on it. Like we're managing our waste properly, and it's these folks over somewhere else that are not. But there's a lot more to the story than that, and a big part of the story is waste exporting. So a lot of the European and North American nations will export their waste to other countries that have even less of an effective waste management infrastructure than we do. And you can see, I believe these are 2021 statistics. So United States, Japan, Germany, and the UK are the top waste exporters, and then we have the top plastic importers. And this changes over time, partially due to regulations, countries not wanting to take other countries' trash, if you can imagine. In 2018, China, which was the biggest importer of the United States plastic waste, all of a sudden just completely banned plastic waste import, because they realized that their recycling was not effective, for a variety of reasons. Again, it's kind of its own story. But after that, unfortunately, a lot of the Western nations kept exporting trash to places that had even less of a waste management infrastructure than China did. So what this ends up looking like, excuse me, is what, pardon me. What this ends up looking like is what some folks have coined the term waste colonialism for. So we have a variety of different countries, most of them still developing nations, that again don't have the means to deal with all of this waste that is being exported to them. And this is what that looks like. Pardon me. So we have a substance that's designed to not biodegrade, and it is also often designed to be disposable, and about 50% of that after just one use. And we are ramping up plastic production. I found this to be a really surprising piece of information when I first received it, that half of plastic ever produced was made since 2005. And less than 9% has ever been recycled. As I mentioned before, we're at more than about, or we're down to about 6% in this country right now. And so, I mean, given all these facts, like, what did we think was going to happen other than something that ends up looking like this? Because we have something that doesn't degrade, and we're not handling it. So why are we allowing this to happen? And the basic answer to that question is this: because plastics are made from fossil fuels and chemicals, and those things are very profitable, and that is pretty much the foundation of the story here. At this point today, plastics are mostly made of a byproduct of the fracking process. That byproduct is ethane. I'll show you a little graphic in just a second. But some of the very first plastics were made of things like coal, oil, and formaldehyde. So this has always been the case, that plastics are made from fossil fuels and chemicals. And it's the foundational reason why folks that profit off of them want us to keep buying more and more and more, despite some of the harms that are becoming absolutely undeniable at this point. So when we talk about today, most plastics are made from a byproduct of gas, that is ethane. So I'm sure folks that are in this Audubon Society are aware of fracking, hydraulic fracking, and how we essentially are removing so-called natural gas, bringing it up from the ground using the process of fracking. One of the byproducts of that process is ethane gas. Ethane gas, the molecule of ethane can be cracked, and that's an important word to use because the plants where this happens are called cracker plants. Ethane gas can be cracked. The molecule becomes ethylene. Ethylene is a building block of stock plastics. So as we have, encountered, I'm sure folks have heard, I mean, it's been 20 or so years, maybe a little bit more, that we've been talking about fracking in the United States. And there has been more and more of it. The byproduct has also been been more and more readily available. And so that has been used in the plastic process. So, we've seen some pictures of widespread plastic pollution, particularly on beaches, in oceans, on our wildlife. But this is also the face of plastic right here. This is not the very beginning. Extraction is the very beginning, but very polluting industrial petrochemical complexes like you see here are also the face of plastic. This is also what it looks like, not just the end result of, litter lying on beaches. So this is where it becomes really concerning from a climate standpoint. It is well known that these plastic plants are, as we at least try to move towards less polluting and renewable energy, the production of plastic is projected to and intended to increase to the point where a lot of the climate community, the climate science community is becoming very concerned because these are the next super polluters. And we'll see a little bit, we'll compare it to coal burning, which, obviously we've been trying to curtail for a very long time. So here's an interesting statistics. If plastic itself were a country, it would be the world's 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter. So we're talking about something that has a very, very significant effect on greenhouse gas emissions and on climate change and global warming. So you can see here, this is comparing the little bar right here is plastic incineration, which is of course also very, very polluting. But you can see here, this is the projection of emissions from just the production part of things. No other portion of it. So beyond plastics, it produces many, many good reports, but one of the thorough and in-depth reports that it has recently published is this one, with a lot of really good information about what is going to happen with the plastic industry's greenhouse gas emissions. So we're looking at the emissions are going to surpass coal-fired power plants by 2030. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like exactly, since 2010, the United States has taken 290 coal-fired power plants offline purposefully because it's dirty energy. There are 217 still in use. And the projected plastics build out looks to put the equivalent of 297 additional coal-fired power plants online over the next couple decades. So as we are trying to make the shift to a cleaner economy and a more green energy sources, there's a whole nother part of industry that will offset those gains that we are making and trying to make with the production of this substance. So just like many things, of course, the pollution by the plastic industry is not shared equally, of course, across states and geographic areas and communities and groups of people. So you can see a lot of the concentration here on this map. A lot of it is in the petrochemical complex areas of Texas and Louisiana, but we're seeing some movement in Illinois and Iowa, and of course over here in Appalachia. And I want to point out a couple of these. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with the term Cancer Alley. This is the 85-mile stretch between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where it's the highest concentration of petrochemical production in the country, and where cancer rates for certain cancers can be up to 50 times higher than they are in other areas. So people there are exposed to the chemicals and the pollution that are associated with petrochemical production. And I took a trip there last April to just sort of get some on the ground research and talk to people in the communities. And everyone I talked to, they know it's called Cancer Alley. They know their cancer rates are higher, and they don't really know what to do about it. And they largely, I mean, everyone I talked to said, we're from here. What can we do? We're not going to move away. This is where we're from. This is where we live. We don't want this to be happening. But this is kind of what the landscape looks like there. You've got things like cemeteries in very impoverished areas with big petrochemical facilities providing the backdrop for everywhere you look. You saw on the map there that there are a few dots up in Appalachia. A couple of those are very new, and they are part of this proposed and being implemented plastic production build out. So one of these is along the banks of the Ohio River in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. This is the Shell Dutch facility being built in August of 2019. This folks might have seen this. This was pretty big news. So this is just a clip from the New York Times. And people were, of course, concerned about it. But economic benefits were touted, and this facility actually got the biggest state tax credit in Pennsylvania's history to the tune of $1.6 billion in credits to build this plant. Ultimately, it will provide about 600 jobs to people in the local area. And some of the sort of scary emission statistics for this particular facility are that it is permitted to emit 2 million tons a year of carbon dioxide and 516 tons of volatile organic compounds. So things like dioxins and benzene, things that are, known carcinogens and certainly aggravating to any sort of asthma or any kind of human health issue. And even though the plant was permitted for amounts that seem very high to me, and I suspect to others as well, they emitted, as far as the volatile organic compounds were concerned, they emitted that within the first month of operation. And so even with those very high emissions allowances, the plant had some issues and was flaring and off-gassing. And about 5 months after being open, they were already hit with a penalty, which $10 million, a lot to us, right? But this was actually the minimum penalty in the state of Pennsylvania. But within 5 months, they were already exceeding their permitted levels of emissions. So additionally, this plant is to produce 1.5 to 3.5 billion tons of nurdles, and I'll show you a picture of nurdles. They're the small building blocks of plastic annually. So do folks remember in May of, I believe, 2022, there was a big fire and a tanker, a big a cargo boat, sank off the coast of Sri Lanka. And one of the things that tanker was carrying was they were carrying several million pounds of these nurdles. And this is the result of those nurdles being spilled into the ocean off the coast of Sri Lanka. So these little things are what are being made at many of these petrochemical plastic production facilities. So that brings us to microplastics, and we're getting close to being done with the really bad news. But there's more bad news. And then we're going to talk about what we can all do to make these things not happen. So there's been a lot of talk. I'm sure that folks on here have heard more and more probably about microplastics. This is actually a microfiber that someone got a photograph of in a snowflake. Just to do a little defining, microplastics are they're particles of plastic that are smaller than 5 millimeters. When they get even smaller, they are called nanoplastics. So there's a lot of concerns here, and I would harken back to the beginning when we're looking at our wildlife, our birds and other wildlife, ingesting pieces of plastic. often these are these relatively small pieces called microplastics that they're ingesting. Microplastics, they don't degrade all the way down, just as plastic just does not biodegrade completely. But they do degrade in the environment, and when they're doing so, they're shedding some of their chemical compounds, and they also can combine with other chemicals. So we have this like really toxic brew going on, even at a very small level, small enough for some of the effects I'm about to show you. So in us, in humans, the medical sector is starting to come out with some extremely disturbing research about how we have microplastics in our bodies. And the microplastics have been found in blood, in the human placenta, in newborn babies. They have been caused to, excuse me, linked to cancer, infertility, and a number of other negative human health issues. The Endocrine Society of the United States has come out with a very long report, 120 pages or so, discussing exactly this topic. You can find it online. It's a very concerning but very informative read about what plastics are doing to our endocrine system, which ultimately controls our bodily systems. I put this in here because this is Dr. Pete Myers, and he actually is the person that originally coined the term endocrine disrupting chemical, or EDC. And he gave a wonderful, very informative webinar for Beyond Plastics a couple months ago, and you can find that on the website. I'm also going to put a few things in the chat when we're done here, and I can see my screen a little bit more, just links to various things for further study. But this is what's going on with us, with humans. And a lot of this medical research, while there has been concern for a very long time, a lot of this research is new and has come out in the past 4 to 6 years, and it has really raised attention and alarm within the medical community. There has also been growing alarm within the agricultural community, because we're starting to find that microplastics are being uptaken into plants. And I'm sorry for this rather busy graphic here, but you can see we've got microplastics in the soil starting down at the bottom. And they combine with heavy metals and organic compounds. They're affecting soil animals, such as just earthworms, nematodes, things that are contributing to our soil health, microbes, and then being uptaken into the plant and doing things like blocking light and releasing toxic substances in our plants. So ultimately, agricultural research has been finding that, there are, of course, eventually reductions in crop yield due to microplastics in soil. But most importantly, what does this mean for birds and other wildlife? Because we're all here for birds, right? So of course there is not as much physiological research occurring in birds and wildlife, and even in plants as in humans. However, there are studies in the works and that have come out documenting accumulation of microplastics in birds of prey, in seabirds, and then in other wildlife, including sea urchins. So some of the foundational creatures of reefs, it is affecting them as well. So at this point, and this is what I'm showing here is a screenshot from a National Audubon Society article. Researchers have actually coined the term plasticosis for disease effects that they're seeing in seabirds. This is a flesh-footed shearwater, and much of this research has been done on shearwaters, petrels, albatrosses, which is really more concerning because we're talking about species that mostly live on very remote and usually uninhabited islands. And so the fact that our plastics and our microplastics are affecting these species to the point where we're seeing diseases in them that are caused by the ingestion of plastic, and they live so remotely from humans, really sort of drives home the point that this is a pervasive issue that is affecting our wildlife and us everywhere across the globe. So, we have sick birds, we have humans that are experiencing disease, including, we're finding elements of plastic in newborns. It's affecting our agricultural systems. So that all sounds very bad. So who's benefiting from this situation? Because it's not us. It might be the folks that say plastics help us protect the environment by reducing waste, lowering greenhouse gas emissions, and saving energy at home, work, and on the road. I don't know about that. That doesn't sound right to me. So industry is rolling out more plastic production. Essentially, this is just an illustration of kind of what I said to you all earlier, where we're trying to make a clean energy transmission and get away from fossil fuels and associated toxins. We have an industry and in combined industries that do not want to give up their large amounts of profits while we're doing that. And so they're shifting to other products, basically. This is not conjecture on my part or the part of Beyond Plastics or any activists or anything like that. This is explicitly said in an American Chemistry Council report in 15 that stated that, hey, we've got all of the foundational constituents of plastic, particularly because of the fracking boom. We've got a lot of this stuff. We can use it to make more plastic. Here are the economic benefits. Here are the numbers in millions and billions of dollars of how this is going to be a great thing. Making more plastic is going to benefit us. So before we get to solutions, let's just make sure we talk about things that are not good solutions. And one of these is there's an organization called the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And I'm sure that there are other industry organizations with similar names. This is just a very, very big one. So this alliance is made up of folks in the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry, and things like the very, very large food companies that are bottling and packaging and using all these plastic products. Coca-Cola is one, PepsiCo is one, Nestle, Unilever, others. So you can check it out online. There's a whole list of the partners of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. And to great fanfare, the Alliance announced that they were going to invest $1.5 billion in cleanup projects. So everything from investing in potentially innovative machinery, technology that would help with ocean cleanup to giving money to nonprofits that do things like river and beach cleanups. But at the same time that they made that announcement, on other channels, they made the announcement that the member companies are investing more than $180 billion in new plastic production plants. So I don't think that those are going to even out. We need to be aware of some things because for decades, we've been told that things like if we just recycle, everything's going to be okay. And there are many different iterations of that and many different false solutions that are often touted as innovation. And the bottom line is that they're all meant to say we can keep producing and using as much plastic as we want to, as long as we do this thing that takes care of it. And there is nothing that is taking care of it. So here are some of those just things to watch out for. chemical recycling, advanced recycling are two of the most popular right now. Voluntary pledges is one. So oftentimes companies such as Coca-Cola will say, we're going to make 20% of our bottles out of recycled materials by the year 2030. Well, that's not going to make much of a dent in Coca-Cola's volume of plastic bottles globally, right? So I think that I would advocate for this, and I think a growing number of people all across the world would advocate that we need to turn off the tap. We need to stop, trying to bail out our overflowing bathtub with a spoon and maybe turn off the tap before we try and clean the place up. So ultimately we need to stop making single-use unnecessary plastics in order to stop the pollution that we're all seeing and all of these really negative effects that are happening. So some things we can all do right now. I know this sounds maybe very simplistic and not that important, but I think it's incredibly important that we keep informing ourselves. There's a lot of information out there, and as a growing topic of concern, there's more and more information available all the time. It is certainly not always the most uplifting information, but I think the more that everybody knows, the more we can, make that cultural shift that is the antithesis of the cultural shift we made when we decided to go towards a disposable lifestyle and use all of these products very carelessly. So community science data programs, I'm going to give an example of that, and I'm sure that there are many such opportunities where you are there in Northern Illinois. And engaging in advocacy, whether that is trying to pressure companies to change their ways, or trying to, of course, affect legislation at the local and state and federal level regarding this topic. Excuse me. So an example of community science data collection, I'm going to give you an example of what we do here in Missouri, but there's many, many groups that do this or something like it. So we take part in a brand audit several times a year with our friends at an organization called Missouri River Relief. Awesome organization based in Central Missouri. They do many river cleanups each year with armies of volunteers. And they've been doing this for over 20 years, and they unfortunately have not at all gotten all of the plastic waste out of the Missouri River. What you are seeing here is about a third of the waste that Missouri River Relief folks pulled out of the Missouri River in one 4-hour morning, one time. And we go through it, and basically we count the different brands. We're just taking a tally of, this bottle is a Pepsi bottle, and this bottle is a Coke bottle, and this bottle is a Sprite bottle, and that is a Coke brand, etc. And we compile all the data. And this is just an example. This is a brand audit we did last fall, and you can see the breakdown where we are. PepsiCo had the most, Coca-Cola had the second most, Sazerac, which I believe is like an alcoholic beverage company, all the way down. You can see the different companies that were represented. And we had ones that we can't tell. I mean, if something's been sitting in the river for even just a little while, it's sometimes, you can't see what the brand is. But you can see too that we collected hundreds and hundreds of shards and pieces of polystyrene, of styrofoam. So that's just some examples of the data that were collected. These data, along with hundreds of others of brand audits, go to an organization called Break Free from Plastic, and they go into a global brand audit report. And this report has been used for advocacy purposes that have changed regulations in some other countries and caused things like producer responsibility laws, where in some cases they're not allowed to sell a specific type of packaging, or they have to collect materials similar to how we used to have returnable bottle deposit laws. So things like that. So the community science data that is collected by just volunteers all over the world has really gone into some tangible results for making change based on simply showing what brands are responsible for the most plastic waste that is in our environment. I wish I had been involved in this, but I wasn't. So back to those little nurdles, those little small building blocks of plastic products. This woman is Diane Wilson, and she started an organization called Nurdle Patrol, and you can see its website down here. Anybody can do a Nurdle Patrol. They have some cool online tools, and you can collect data. And what Diane and her group did down in Texas, Gulf Coast of Texas, is they collected all these data on these nurdles in the environment right near a petrochemical facility owned by Formosa Plastics. And they eventually made the case that Formosa was illegally releasing these plastic nurdles into the bay, into the environment. And what ultimately ended up happening after several years of collecting data for the Nurdle Patrol is that Nurdle Patrol sued Formosa in the biggest Clean Water Act suit ever brought by private citizens, and they won. And Formosa has been ordered to pay not just the Nurdle Patrol folks, but for cleanup efforts throughout the bay and for environmental projects and restoration projects. And Nurdle Patrol did get some of the settlement, and what they are doing is using it to train more Nurdle Patrol volunteers to be able to do this over a wider area. And finally, back to Louisiana. Those were two sort of citizen science data collection projects that have actually, resulted in very tangible changes. But just from the organizing standpoint of just regular folks like us, regular community members, in Louisiana, this group called Rise St. James, they've gotten to be pretty famous in the plastic advocacy sector, because what they did is they organized and they ultimately stopped the the construction of I believe it was $9 billion, a huge, again, Formosa Plastics production facility in St. James Parish in Louisiana. Yep, 9.4 billion. And this happened because these community activists kept questioning what are the regulations that are allowing this to happen, and what are the permits, and what is this plant going to actually emit, and using case studies to show that it was going to emit a lot more than the company said. And so ultimately the plant lost its permits to operate because of the activism of Rise St. James, and it has not been built in St. James Parish. So a bit of a David and Goliath story to end on, but just to say that we citizens can do something about this situation. So to end here, and I'm going to just put up a couple resources at the very end, but to end here, no one wants a world that looks like this. No one does. And this is where we're going. And we shouldn't, right? We all want a world that looks like this instead. So to quote Food and Water Watch, I encourage people to do this, to not let this plastic pollution situation occur. And I really thank you for what you guys are already doing. I looked at the Northwest Illinois Audubon website quite extensively, and you're already doing amazing work in so many ways. So I thank you for having me and for dealing with the tech situation as well. And before we end, just a couple resources. Like I said, when I stop the screen share, I'm going to put them in the chat, and I can send them to you, Teresa, to send to folks who are there in person if you would like. But we had a really deep dive into the history of plastics as well as more of the chemistry from a colleague of mine. And I'll put that link in the chat. And then I have this whole huge list of resources for further reading and watching. It is by no means comprehensive. There's so much coming out on this topic lately, but if folks want to check that out, I have it posted online, and this is the QR code that will get you to it.
Dane, I'm going to temporarily unmute. Everyone should be able to unmute if you've got questions, or you can type in the chat box as well. Because of the echoing, if we have people in the audience here in Freeport, if you have questions, we'll type them in the chat.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to put some of those resources that I said into the chat. Thank you, Teresa. I'm glad people loved the solutions. There are a lot of things that can be done. I see, how do microplastics get into ag land? There's lots and lots of different pathways at this point. Uh, Goodness. Some of it is from things like manure, waste, and fertilizer spreading. Microplastics are so pervasive, and they're in so many things at this point, that they're even in those treatment substances, if you will, that are spread on ag lands. We're starting to realize that small microplastic particles are actually being carried in the air and, of course, in the water. So there is some research coming out that is using things like weather stations and just methodology that measures rainfall, as well as like air deposition, even into areas like in fairly remote national parks in the Western United States. And they're finding that we have microplastics being deposited by just wind and rain as well. So lots of different ways. Are things like um, well, we have things like tires that are shedding microplastics, unfortunately, all the time. And we also have, in a more garden setting as opposed to like a larger agricultural setting, things like weed barriers and things that we've all been using for years have been shedding microplastics into our garden areas. Also plastic, I see also plastic tenting. On ground to reduce weeds, yep, tire mulch and crumb use, yeah. So lots and lots of different pathways. If we're, I don't know if folks know this, I didn't really know this until not super long ago, but municipal waste, even our waste, it has to go somewhere. And sometimes it's spread in an agricultural setting, and we have it in our bodies now. So lots of ways. Any more questions over there, Teresa, or anyone on Zoom? We have plastics recycling in Freeport. Should we put all types of plastics in the bin? Definitely. I mean, no. Please don't. Um, please don't. Your recycling facility or the city, if the city is in fact managing, if it's like curbside recycling, they will be able to tell you what they take. It's probably just ones and twos, at the very most fives. The problem with putting with wish cycling and putting other numbers into bins is that it can really mess up the material recovery facility. It's an MRF or MRF. That's where our materials that are attempted to be recycled are ultimately going, is MRFs. And things like, for instance, plastic bags can literally gum up the machinery in a MRF. And so and what will happen is that the materials that we just like kind of hope we're recycling, but they're not actually legitimately taking, they will simply be taken and thrown away. So as much as it is painful, it is better if you take that plastic thing that can't be recycled, and put it in the trash with your regular trash. The state of legislation across the nation on decreasing single-use plastics is honestly a couple-hour talk in and of itself. I'll see if I can summarize. There are various states that have uh, statewide bans on particular plastic products. So I don't know the numbers. It changes quite a lot, and some are coming online soon, but I want to say approximately 12 to 15 states right now have bans on single-use plastic bags, the shopping bags. I know at least 5 states have polystyrene bans, so bans on styrofoam. I believe Oregon was the most recent one to enact a ban on polystyrene. There are some other states, such as my own, where you are not allowed to ban anything. So even if a town, say Kansas City, Missouri, wanted to not have plastic bags in our city, we are not allowed to do that. So, and that was very much intentional. And at the federal level, there have been bills introduced. One of them was called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. It had a lot of really, really good, solid line items in it. My understanding from staffers of the people that introduced the bill, of the senator and representative that introduced the bill, it will not be passed ever in its entirety with our Congress in its current configuration. And their hope is to get some of the more significant line items potentially passed with other infrastructure bills. So one of the most important things that the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act at the federal level had on it was a pause, a 3-year pause on all plastic production facilities being built, so that something like that Shell plant in Pennsylvania that I showed y'all, that would be heavily investigated before any permits were issued, to really look at and to take into account things like the greenhouse gas emission effects, and things of that nature. So really get a really solid review before we just keep building out these plastic production facilities. So those are some examples of what's going on. Yes, there's a lot of work trying to break plastics back down into their base components for reuse. There's a lot of difficulty with it that I mean, that's ultimately what recycling tries to do, whether it's mechanical recycling. The problem is the original constituents are fossil fuels and chemicals, and many of those chemicals are toxic. And so breaking them down might mean melting them, right? And so we're not only creating like a sludge waste and a less high quality product than the original plastic product, but we're also creating a lot of emissions as well. And it's also very energy intensive. And to date, chemical recycling, so attempts to break down plastic products into their constituent components via chemicals, has also proven to be inefficient and also heavily there are toxins heavily involved in that process as well. So people are trying, and ultimately there might hopefully be a solution for the truly useful plastic products, right? So like I mentioned, the medical products that that save lives. So those things, perhaps there will be a true recycling process for those at some point in our lives, but all of this single use, the film and stuff like that, no one has come up with a good way to really truly recycle it. Keeping plastic bags in your garage, what should you do with them? There is very limited plastic bag recycling that does occur. It is not as much as we think, but there are a couple companies that do actually take plastic bags and recycle them into things like benches. There are more and more questions about the things like the emissions and waste products of that process by which they're turning plastic bags into other products, but there is a limited amount of that. So an option is to take those plastic bags to a receptacle. I know like our Walmart has that. Some of the studies that have involved putting technological trackers on bins of plastic that's meant for recycling have followed those bales of our plastic bags into places where we didn't think they were going. So it's not, an absolutely 100% definite method, but either that or they should be thrown away. It sounds really bad, but recycling and plastic ending up in the environment are both such bad situations, and incineration as well of plastics, that one of our best, in many cases, our best choice right now is landfilling. And as far as better to put plastics in the garbage or recycling, again, try recycling numbers 1 and 2. And if your community takes them 5. But otherwise, garbage. I'm sorry to say it. Um, Kathleen, yes, I'm going to put my email into the chat. Kathleen asked about schools. There are a lot of really good school programs, and the situation in schools is really, 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 really concerning. Because since, my day when everything was on reusables and the cafeteria like washed things and we reused them, like my understanding now is that um in the vast majority of schools, kids are eating out of single-use plastic and off single-use plastic every day, and that is a very disturbing proposition. Yes, D. D. Wilkie. I'm probably not saying your last name right, but from Safe Healthy Playing Fields. You guys are awesome. Downcycling does not remove toxic and carcinogenic chemicals in plastics, just hides them in other plastics. Absolutely. I'm sorry for all the bad news, everyone. I know that it's not, welcome news to be like, our recycling isn't working at all. Um, but it's better to be aware and able to tackle the problem, I think, than not aware of it. Yes, Teresa, Beyond Plastics is a great resource. There's so much information on the Beyond Plastics website. There's fact sheets and template legislation and ordinances and webinars and reports and all kinds of things. So definitely highly recommended. And it's just beyondplastics.org. Thank you very much, Teresa and everyone. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the hybrid meeting. I would love to be there, but I'm actually at another conference also. So thanks.
Thanks, Dana.